Good morning. Thank you all for coming on what was forecast to be an ugly morning. My name is Jack Sorensen, and I'm the co-chair of the Committee on for Financial Affairs in Retirement. And we're here this morning to talk a little bit about the federal budget, Social Security. So our speaker this morning is Ms. Lisa K. Lampkins from AARP. Lisa was born and raised in Nebraska, but ended up going to school at Grinnell in Iowa, majoring in political science. She went from there to the University of Missouri, Kansas City, got her degree in public administration. She then spent the next 25 years working in nonprofit membership organizations. Prior to going to AARP, she was with the American Colleges of Nursing, and prior to that, I've got to read this one because I just enjoyed it, the American Apparel Manufacturers Association. Lisa is currently the Advocacy Director, Federal Issues for AARP Wisconsin. Her current responsibilities at AARP focus on leading advocacy campaigns within Wisconsin, coordinating grassroots and key contact activity in support of AARP's legislative agenda, and providing in-depth, substantive issue training to AARP volunteers, staff, and partners on AARP priority issues with an emphasis in healthcare and financial security areas. Lisa also provides leadership and coordination on public policy development and advancement of the AARP's public policy agenda. This is a small group, so we would hope that everybody gets all their questions answered. And I will now turn it over to Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, well, hopefully you can hear me okay. I did a mic test, and so it sounds like it's sounding okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me back again to come and chat with you guys for a little while. We're going to talk about Medicare, Social Security, the federal budget, this new Congress, some of the things that are going on. Well, you're in good company because we have about 852,000 AARP members just in the state of Wisconsin. And as you probably know then, we're a nonpartisan membership organization focusing on people age 50 plus. And I want to sort of highlight the nonpartisan piece because while I'm not going to spend time really talking about the election, obviously that sets the stage for our federal budget, for working Social Security and Medicare. While AARP is political, we're not partisan. So I just wanted to make sure that folks understood that. So we'll talk a little bit about just sort of set the stage, what does Congress look like now, and then what's the federal budget looking like right now? Not so hot, so there's really not too much to talk about there, right? And then we'll talk about Social Security and Medicare. So I kind of wanted to include this because this was an interesting snapshot. This is one of those word clouds that was created from when AARP members contact AARP. So this is just, the bigger the word, the more contacts we got about it. So this is just sort of a snapshot in time of just a segment, but obviously some of the things that older voters were interested in when people were just contacting us. Now, AARP was like, okay, well, that's interesting, but let's do a survey. So after the election, AARP actually did a national survey of general election voters, a phone survey right away, to ask what were the issues that were the top of mind when they were voting. And this was kind of interesting because there was clearly a divide. For voters age 50 plus, Social Security, healthcare, and Medicare were at the top of their minds. For younger voters, it was education, jobs, and the economy and healthcare. Now, this was a little interesting to me because I'll be perfectly honest. If you'd asked me prior to the election, I didn't think anybody was talking about Social Security, right? We were not hearing this, even really Medicare, a little bit tied in with some of the healthcare discussions, But Social Security was not a hot topic on the campaign trail. But I think what it sort of shows is some of the ongoing power of these issues and just the staying power. It always seems to kind of come to the forefront when older people are asked about issues that they care about. Now, this age divide in voting, it was also pretty interesting. You know, about 20 years ago, there wasn't even really an age divide in terms of the electorate. But this divide was pretty substantial. Younger voters in this last election highly favored Democratic candidates. Voters ages 18 to 29 went 67% for Democratic candidates. Voters between the ages of 30 and 44 went 58% for Democratic candidates. And older voters over the age of 45 were roughly divided, and it was about 49% for Dems, 50% for Republicans. So you can see some pretty big splits in that. And so what did that mean for the Congress that was just elected? So we now have the 116th Congress that has been seated. It is by far, and I'm sure you've read this and heard this a million times now, but it's by far one of the most diverse House classes in history. The sort of the new incoming class into the House of Representatives has more women of color, more people who are openly LGBTQ, more millennials. The 115th Congress, the last Congress, is one of the oldest in history. But this new Congress, with the whole new group that was in, the average age in the House of Representatives dropped a decade, from 57 to 47. So there are a lot of now like Gen Xers and millennials who were elected. There was a really interesting graphic in Business Insider, and I couldn't really quite figure out how to put it in here, but it was one of those charts where you could change, you know, by which dimension you wanted to look at it. So if you get a chance, you can Google the Business Insider election results, and I have this really cool sort of representative of the House, you know, the seating chart of the House of Representatives, and it showed the different dimensions. So we have this, you know, interesting new House of Representatives. Senate, of course, still controlled by Republicans. They even gained a couple of seats. So what's Congress have to do? What's on their plate? Well, of course, they still have a couple of leftover issues, not insignificant issues, by the way, some things that they have to deal with: trade, foreign policy, immigration, infrastructure. But the big key new issues are healthcare, and of course now government funding. It was funny, I made this presentation about probably a week ago, and I was like, okay, Lisa, you know, remember to go back and kind of think about if you have to erase, you know, government funding, if we aren't in the middle of a government shutdown, it will be resolved by the time of this presentation. Well, of course, you know, I didn't really go back, and it doesn't matter because now we're at day 25 of a government shutdown. Longest in history, which is unfortunately, as you might imagine, sort of tainting all of the other stuff that's happening. But healthcare is probably the thing you're hearing the most about, and probably some of the stuff that Congress will deal the most about in the short term. So as they look at all of these issues, much of it is in the context of our rising federal budget deficit. And this really sets the stage for some of the work that this Congress can accomplish. You know, the CBO has come out and said we are on track to have a budget deficit that reaches $1 trillion. That is no small deficit. And there are a lot of people, a lot of members of Congress, a lot of people in the public who are very, very concerned about that, obviously. So what has added to that deficit? Well, there are three key things. One, of course, is military and defense spending. That has doubled since 9/11. You know, we've put huge amounts into things like the Department of Homeland Security. So that has increased the deficit substantially. It is probably not a huge shock to folks to hear that the tax cuts, the tax reform bill, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, is also adding substantially to the deficit, largely because we're losing out on revenue, right? Tax cuts of the personal income tax rate, slashing the corporate income tax rate. All of that basically means we're coming up with about $1.5 trillion less in revenue over the next 10 years. That's the amount that's being added to the deficit just from that one particular piece. Now, the supporters of the tax reform said, well, you know what, new economic growth, this is gonna spur all this economic growth, and that's gonna offset the loss in revenue. So far, at least, indicators are that's really not happening. Our spending has increased by 7%. Our revenue is down or on track to increase by less than 1%. Of course, mandatory spending also does add to the deficit. But the initial reaction from a lot of people, and particularly people who want to make some harmful changes generally to things like Social Security and Medicare, is people hear the deficit's up. Well, okay, who are we going to blame? We're going to blame entitlement spending, right? It can only be entitlement spending that's driving the deficit up. But the figures don't really bear that out. Social Security, yes, it's a big expenditure, $1 trillion, nearly $1 trillion on Social Security. But it's financed via the payroll tax and the Social Security Trust Fund. It's not adding to the deficit. Medicare, also big expenditure, $625 billion spent on Medicare. But only about half of that is money that gets added to the deficit because of things like premiums and co-pays and payroll taxes. A lot of times people forget that people pay payroll taxes on Medicare. Younger people in particular, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, they think Medicare is free and that nobody's paying Medicare premiums and all of this stuff. And we'll talk about how much you guys really are paying when it comes to some of that. But I will also say that kind of the two biggest drivers this past year, I want to actually go back to mandatory spending. Because while those things aren't adding hugely to the deficit, there is other mandatory spending that does add to the deficit. Medicaid, for example, other low-income programs, housing programs, some student loan programs. Some of that stuff does add to the deficit, but not nearly to the extent as Medicare spending, defense spending, and the tax cut, the loss in revenue. There were two huge drivers this past year. One, of course, was the tax cut. The other was that Congress actually passed a bipartisan budget bill early in 2018 that let them lift some spending caps. There had been some caps put into place to rein in federal spending, and they voted to lift those caps, which let them sort of skyrocket some of the spending, particularly in the military arena. So those things have all added to this sort of crushing and really expanding deficit. So when we look at programs that we care about, things like Social Security and Medicare, we know there are people in Congress who say the only solution to the deficit is to cut those programs. And I will tell you, at least from AARP's perspective, we don't believe that to be true, and we think those programs, while they may need some tweaks in some areas, simply slashing them to help the deficit, it's not going to help the deficit at all. So I want to go now and start to look at Social Security, kind of take a look at some of just the basic background around Social Security, and then a couple of the reform proposals and what the outlook is for 2019 and beyond. So of course is FDR signing Social Security into law in 1935. The first benefits were paid out in 1937 to about 53,000 Americans. There are about 60 million people today who get Social Security benefits. So who gets Social Security? It is largely retired workers, just as you would expect that it would be. But I love this pie chart because it is a reminder of the other people who depend on Social Security. At AARP, we like to call it a family income protection program because it protects the families of workers as well as the workers themselves. It helps disabled workers, spouses, widows, children. So there are a lot of people who really depend on Social Security. We also know that Social Security has really been the best federal poverty program, and it keeps millions of seniors out of poverty every year. There are about 1/4 of seniors who rely on Social Security for 90% of their income. And there's about 30% of people in Wisconsin, of seniors, who don't have any other source of income except for the Social Security benefit that they get. So we know Social Security was never meant to be the sole source of income, but unfortunately for too many people it really is. But at least we have that, and we have that bedrock of Social Security. We know Social Security is good for individuals, but it's also good for the economy, and a lot of times people don't think about that. Social Security brings in about supports 9 million jobs nationwide and adds 1.4 trillion to the national economy. That's a lot, and this is annually. That's a lot of money. What does it look like in Wisconsin? 96% of Wisconsin seniors get Social Security. The average benefit is a little over $15,000 a year, and this is just a couple $100 over the national average. The average monthly benefit is $1,281. That is for men. Women get a couple $100 less than that, which is not a lot of money to live on if you're, $1,200, $1,300 a month as an average benefit is not a lot of money to pay for, a mortgage or rent and utilities and food and car payments and all that good stuff. In Wisconsin, the impact on our economy is also pretty good. $15.6 billion worth of Social Security benefits come into the state every year. And I think I already mentioned about 30% of Wisconsin seniors rely just on Social Security. But I know it's no surprise to you guys, Social Security has some big challenges, and has for a while, right? People are living longer, people are spending more years in retirement. There are changing demographics in the workplace. When Social Security started in 1935, a lot of women didn't work outside of the home. We also have people today, women in particular, who sort of go in and out of the workforce. Maybe you start working, take time off to raise a family. We have caregivers now. We have almost really a caregiving crisis where we have workers of lots of ages who have to take time in and out of work in order to do caregiving responsibilities. And we obviously have fewer people entering the workforce. It's about 2.8 workers for every one beneficiary right now, and that's gonna move in a little bit less than 20 years to about 2.1 workers for every beneficiary. So we used to have a whole bunch of workers paying in, for each worker who's retired. That has sort of narrowed. Now, what's interesting is I haven't really seen many updated figures on that, given some of the millennials, because you always, we keep reading and keep hearing that the millennial generation is just as big, if not bigger, than the baby boom generation. So then I would think we would sort of again start to have a lot of workers adding in to the workforce. We also have now more people who are earning money over above the wage cap, that cap on which people pay Social Security benefits. When this program started, most people were they didn't even have the cap for a long time, but even when we put the cap in place, most people were well under that. And now we have a lot of people making over that. And I'm gonna talk in a minute a little bit more about that. This next slide I like. I think in your handouts it didn't really copy super well. However, if you are an AARP member and you get the AARP bulletin, you might have seen this. There was a terrific article on Social Security in the bulletin. So I stole this from the bulletin. Of course, I can't see it on my slide either. I have to look at my copies. My vision seems to be going as I've reached my 50s. I really like this as sort of a picture representation of the Social Security program. 174, you kind of see it starts over here. 174 million workers contribute to Social Security. And then between those contributions, between the worker contributions, the employer contributions, interest on the trust fund, taxes on Social Security benefits, all of that sort of adds up to about $996 billion sort of coming into the Social Security system. Now, you know, of course, for a long time, everybody knows more was coming in than was going out. So there's the trust fund. Now, today, the trust fund has about $2.8 trillion in it. That was actually by the end of 2017, $2.8 trillion in that trust fund. And that's sort of that middle red section, I guess. And then, of course, money goes out to pay benefits. 63 million people getting benefits. Of course, the vast majority are retirees. But then there are other people getting those benefits as well, those other categories we talked about. And that figure was about 952 billion. Now that was still, this is all from 2017 figures. And in 2017, that figure was still a little less, the amount of money going out. Some of that changed in 2018. And so I want to look at some of the key dates we have for Social Security. One of the things that whenever I talk about Social Security, I like to talk about this because we know there are a lot of people who say, that's it, Social Security is going broke, the trust fund's going to be depleted. You know, we've got less than 20 years and there's going to be no money left in Social Security. Well, that's not entirely true, right? But people who want to make drastic changes to Social Security or get rid of it entirely want there to sort of be a sky is falling mentality around it. So I always like to sort of look at the dates and what those mean. So back in 2010, Social Security benefits outpaced just the payroll tax revenue for the first time. But there was still enough interest on the trust fund to make up that amount. So, okay, we're doing good, but we're going to start using the interest. 2010 was basically the first time we started to use the interest from the trust fund to help pay those benefits. Now, in 2018, just at the end of last year, the interest on the trust fund was not enough to pay for the benefits. So for the very first time, we had to redeem some of the actual Treasury bonds. It was kind of funny, though. I looked and tried to find out how much did we have to redeem, and I couldn't really find that anywhere, but I saw several articles that were like, well, for the very first time, we have to dip into the trust fund and actually redeem some of the bonds to help pay for those benefits. And it's 2034 is the date, according to the Social Security Administration, when the trust fund will be depleted. Now, that was actually kind of the plan all along. It was never like we're always going to have this huge trust fund. It's like if there's extra money, it's going to go here. And that, you know, there were changes and a plan sort of extending the retirement age and sort of looking at the baby boomers. Everybody talks about, oh, the baby boomers are, you know, eating up all of the Social Security and all of the Medicare. Well, it's not as if baby boomers came as a surprise. Like all of a sudden, oh my gosh, where did all these people come from? They're all 65, holy cow. Who knew they were coming? They knew they were coming, right? And so some changes had been made in Social Security ages ago, back in the 80s, to sort of help work for some of that. But one of the things what I like to always remind people, and you guys know this, but when your kids and your grandkids or your neighbors or other people sort of talk about this and they say, Social Security is going broke, it's not going to be there for me, remember, even when the trust fund is gone, payroll tax money, employer money, some of that other stuff is still coming in. It can still pay, I see anywhere between 75 and 80% of benefits. That's still a really big chunk, right? I mean, that's still a lot of benefits that can still be paid. So we need to tweak Social Security so that people who are going to retire after that point, that would be me, that's about my retirement age, people can get their full 100% of benefits. But I think it's really helpful in those conversations, especially when your kids and grandkids say it's not going to be there. Remind them that it will be there, and that they can make sure that it's there. by some of the people that they elect to Congress and some of the things that they do. So I want to talk now, before we sort of look at some of the proposals that Congress is sort of looking at, I want to just mention a couple things in terms of the outlook for Social Security. One of the things has to do with the agency funding. Now, the Social Security Administration is not being hampered by the government shutdown. Their budget has passed. They have received their funding. In fact, the Social Security Administration actually got a little bit of an increase, about a $480 million increase in its annual budget. So their annual budget is about $12.5 billion, which sounds like a ton of money, but it's not really a ton of money in the grand scheme of the federal budget. They support a lot of employees when you take a look at what it takes to run the federal budget. There's 60,000 federal employees, 10,000 state employees, and I mean across all 50 states, not just in Wisconsin, 1,200 field offices, and 26 telephone centers. That sounds like a lot of folks, right? Only it's still really not enough folks. People may have read or heard or seen about a report recently that came out that there are 800,000 people who are currently on the disability insurance sort of waiting list to see if they get Social Security disability. There's been a huge increase in disability applications probably over the past 10 years due to the recession and due to baby boomers who are getting older and tend to have more disability issues. But Social Security, as this is certainly not new, is really struggling with processing those. This new report that came out, though, sort of highlighted for the first time that in 2018, there were 10,002 people who died while they were waiting to get Social Security benefits. So that is something, obviously, that nobody wants. And so they're struggling to sort of figure out how do we get through this backlog, which is why agency funding for Social Security is kind of a bigger issue in some ways than it has been in the past. And then the only other thing I want to mention is, it says there are 1,200 field offices, and I don't know if people really followed or paid attention or heard much. They closed a field office in Milwaukee last year, and they closed it in a part of town where people already had a hard time sort of getting places, but now people have to take a bus and it's not accessible. It was in a part of town that largely served a minority population. And there is some push now to have sort of a more stringent process if a field office is going to be closed. Representative Gwen Moore represents the Milwaukee area, and she is going to be fighting and wants to make sure that there are things like hearings or that they hear from the community. It was basically like a letter went out that said, oh, this office is going to be closed, see ya. And there was no input from the community, no chance to say, hey, this is really crummy. So that might be something that we'll see down the road as well. Just a couple of other things in terms of Social Security and the outlook. I have up here, one of the things to think about is that purchasing power of Social Security is diminishing, which might seem backwards because you guys are just like, hey, we just got a 2.8% COLA for next year. That's the highest it's been in a long time. And for a long time, you didn't get anything, right? So that sounds really, really good. And it is, of course, it's better than nothing. However, the prices of all of the other stuff that older people tend to buy are going up way more than that. Healthcare, prescription drugs, those kinds of things. Even with the Social Security COLA, it's hard to keep pace with the trajectory rise in healthcare costs. But again, I want to reiterate that Social Security is not going to go bankrupt. The earlier that we can make some adjustments, the less drastic some of those adjustments have to be. However, this is probably not a shock to you guys. Congress is not going to reform Social Security anytime soon, right? In order to do something, it's going to have to be bipartisan action. We are not yet in an era of large bipartisanship in Congress. And what's so funny is during the election, everybody surveyed, but the public is like, come on, all I want is people to sit down, be able to sit down and do something, work across the aisle, let's get something done. And we're not at that point yet. I'm gonna have rose-colored glasses and say, we'll get there sometime. But until there can be bipartisan action on Social Security, not much is likely to happen. However, there are some reform proposals that are still kind of taking shape and that get talked about a lot. So I just want to talk really briefly about, I think, 3 different proposals, and then I'll open it up to questions, comments, and your thoughts on kind of Social Security. None of these proposals in terms of Social Security are particularly new or innovative or things you probably haven't heard of or thought about before. But they are 3 things that still seem to have some traction and some viability among members of Congress. One, of course, is to raise the retirement age. It's already been raised up to age 67 for anyone born over 1960. But there are people who continue to say, well, let's raise it up to 68, let's raise it up to 70. And why should we do that? Well, supporters will say people are living longer. Actually, I think this even. People are living longer, life expectancy is going up. Social Security is just not keeping pace. When people retired in 1935, a man generally spent about 13 years in retirement, and now that is 18 years. And a woman used to spend 15 years in retirement, and now that's closer to 20 years. And so people say, well, we just got to raise that retirement age so people aren't spending, quite so long in retirement. People who say, no, well, we really shouldn't raise the retirement age will argue, well, first of all, most of the arguments we hear is, for some jobs it can be really hard to keep working until you're, 65, 66, 67, 70. It gets harder and harder for some manual labor jobs. But it's also important to know that any of those increases in longevity mostly went to higher wage workers. And whenever you raise the retirement age, it's an automatic across the board cut, 6 to 8% for every year that you increase the age. And that hits generally sort of minority and low income workers harder. Now, I think it's also interesting, just the past couple of years, life expectancy, we sort of hit this, this huge peak, and we've seen a little dip. It's gone down a little bit. It's largely been attributed to the opioid crisis and an increase in suicide. So 2 horrible things. I do hope we reverse those trends soon. But that, that might be something people can't say, hey, we just keep going up and up and up in terms of life expectancy. So that raising the retirement age still seems to be a very popular option. Another popular option, not so much popular, another option that has actually been proposed a couple of times, and I think is one to keep your eye on, because it's been proposed by both Democrats and Republicans. And I talked about that cost of living adjustment and sort of saying, oh, we're sort of losing purchasing power. But there are some people who argue that cost of living adjustment is too generous, which is a tough argument to make, I know, but there are some who say the cost of living adjustment is too generous and we need to recalculate that. Let's use a different method to calculate that and use what's called the chained CPI. If you were to use the chained CPI, and what a chained CPI is, it's basically it's a substitution model. So if the price of chicken goes up to $8 a pound, you won't just buy chicken, which meaning that your expenses would continue to go up and you'd need more in your market basket of goods. You'd substitute hamburger for $5 a pound. Therefore, your cost of living adjustment doesn't need to be as much because you'd be substituting lower price items along the way. Well, as you can imagine, that's A, hard to do when in retirement most people have already made a lot of those substitutions, and B, how do you substitute healthcare? But the idea around the chained CPI is the cost of living adjustments can be sort of ratcheted down a little bit. A lot of times they'll call it a technical correction. People who support the chained CPI will call it a technical correction to that calculation. Now here's why it's even more sort of important to pay attention to this, is because in the tax reform bill, we are now applying a chained CPI to things like the personal income tax brackets. So we're using it in some programs already. It's not being applied to Social Security yet, but it's something that a lot of people aren't necessarily paying attention to, but it does have a big impact, because if your cost of living adjustment doesn't increase that much every year, it might seem like a small amount, but it adds up over time, right? You get a little bit less and a little bit less over time, then you're losing out on a pretty significant chunk of money. There are other people who say we should use what's called an elderly index. An elderly index actually accounts for things like healthcare and the cost of prescription drugs. Now, the elderly index would result in larger cost of living adjustments. However, it's obviously not going to help extend the solvency of Social Security if you're giving everybody a little bit more. But people would argue, but we can actually live on a little bit more if we were able to keep pace with that. So the chained CPI is a proposal that pops up sort of perennially, lately. So that's something we're keeping our eyes on. I could do those. And then the last one is probably by the most popular proposal by far, which is to change or eliminate the payroll tax cap. For 2019, workers will pay Social Security taxes on up to $132,900. So anything over that, of course, people and employers don't have to pay Social Security taxes on. When Congress first put that tax cap into place, it was in the 1970s, and it captured about 90% of all of the wages that were earned in this country. But now, there are a lot of people who are earning more than $132,900. So some people argue, okay, well, let's raise that cap to a level that captures, more wages. Something around circa $300,000. Let's get up to sort of where the intention of Congress, where Congress intended it to be. And that's pretty popular. There are some people who say, eliminate it entirely. Have LeBron James, pay Social Security taxes on I'm probably getting this wrong, $10 million he earns every year? I don't know, somebody correct me. Am I way off? 4 or 5 million, okay. So see, I have no idea. Oh, 4 or 5, okay, way off. So anyway, I should look that stuff up before I use him as an example. I used to use Oprah, but now she's just not as popular as, say, LeBron James. Anyway, people would argue, okay, really super high earners should pay that payroll tax on all of that. This is very, very popular because it's always popular to tax other people, right? Changing or eliminating that payroll tax cap only actually impacts about 6% of workers. The vast majority of workers, the vast majority of us earn under that. So there's also a feeling of fairness. Hey, we pay the Social Security payroll tax on 100% of our wages. Shouldn't these other people? Now there are people who would argue, okay, well, one of the reasons Social Security is so popular because everybody pays in and everybody pays out. And of course, there are different income replacement rates, but if you were to sort of keep that principle in place, would we end up then with LeBron James getting a monthly benefit of $100,000 a month or something based on, how much he paid in? And does that really then ultimately help the solvency of Social Security? Still, this remains by far the most wildly popular proposal, and one, if there's any sort of discussions around Social Security, which I actually really don't anticipate that there will be, but this would be the one that I would see sort of rising to the top kind of at this point. I think that's it. Questions, comments, thoughts. I always am particularly interested to hear people's thoughts on what you think, sort of the state of Social Security is, and what you think a good proposal or a good, what do you think is a good way to sort of extend the solvency of it? I'm sure, when we work with our AARP volunteers, they say they sort of keep fighting for Social Security because they want to make sure it's there for their kids and grandkids, and I'm sure most of you feel the same way. What's the best way for us to get there?
If you have a question, if you can raise your hand, that way we can capture this on the video as well, and I'll run to you and take your question. Thank you. Also, any of you who did not get a handout on the way in, there are additional handouts available if you'd like to pick one up at break. Thank you.
This should be an easy question. Why do women get less than men?
Why do women get less than men? Because we earn less, right? Still about 70 cents on the dollar that men earn. And women tend to take more time out of the workforce, right? In the past, will this change? I really, really, really hope so. I have 2 kids. I did not take time, I took my maternity leave, but I didn't take any time out of the workforce. My mother didn't actually really go to work outside of the home until I was a senior in high school.
But it's based on quarters?
It's based on your income. So there is a correlation between, everybody, you have to pay in 40 quarters in order to, be eligible to get your Social Security benefit. But your benefit is still, it's a pretty complicated calculation. It still has a relation to the amount that you pay in. There is a maximum Social Security benefit. So if you're paying in at that sort of upper, payroll tax cap level, you'll get the maximum benefit. I forgot to look up what it was for 2019. It's circa $2,900, though, is the maximum benefit. There is no minimum benefit, however, but it's tied to your income. So we got to change that too.
Regarding low-income people and Social Security, if I recall, there is an SSI program that supplements, and I think those people, if I'm correct, also get eligibility for Medicaid.
I'm actually really, really glad that you asked that, because there's a lot of confusion around the program known as SSI, which is Supplemental Security Income. And yes, it is for very low income people, and it's a cash payment that helps them. A lot of people say, oh, they're draining. I know this isn't what you said, but I just want to dispel this myth. A lot of people say they're draining the Social Security system. They didn't work in enough, they haven't paid in. SSI is it's administered by the Social Security Administration, but it does not come out of Social Security funds. It's kind of like, oh, hey, you have the ability to cut these checks, so we're gonna give you this program to manage. But it's a pot of money over here. And yes, often they are eligible for Medicaid as well. But it's separate funds from Social Security. And there's a lot of confusion around it. It's confusing because the names sound the same, Supplemental Security Income, and because the Social Security Administration cuts the checks. But they cut your Social Security checks out of this pot of money, and they cut the SSI checks out of this pot of money over here. So hopefully does that make sense? Okay, good.
I wanted to put a Oh, here, let him grab the mic.
I wanted to put a face on my children's generation. My daughter's 54. Now, salaried workers, not hourly workers, can put in 60 hours a week as a matter of course and are expected to. And she says, is she going to be able to do that to the age of 67 or 68? And that, I don't know how, and if she loses her job, she will probably not, at her age, get anything equivalent. So that's a face on retiring at 67 or 68 when you're working 60 hours a week. That's one question, or one comment. But your stance on Medicare for all, and the other thing is, ARP unfortunately lobbied the legislatures not to have insurance companies contest healthcare costs or drug costs. Is that still true?
So we're going to talk all things healthcare after the break. So I want to come back to those pieces, okay? Just because if I get off on a healthcare tangent, you guys, I will never stop. But I do want to talk about what you said in terms of your daughter and Social Security. Believe me, I'm 52, and I feel her pain. And I wonder sometimes, I mean, AARP, you think, oh, this is not a very physical job. But honestly, there are times that I'm like, oh, we're going to go do a fair in Wausau. So I have to drive up to Wausau, lug all these boxes. I mean, I have a cart back there with, I'm always hauling boxes somewhere to set up some event. And of course, I can't complain. I have two of my volunteers are here in the audience who are like, what are you talking about? You send us to those fairs. We're there too. But it is very daunting to sort of do all of that. And I will say one thing that we don't really talk about, but it's actually going to be a really big issue for AARP nationally, is the issue of age discrimination, which of course, has been around for a very long time. But as people are saying, oh, well, you should be working longer. Why aren't you working longer? Okay, well, what job will I be able to get? And, we've had recessions where that 2008 recession, a lot of older workers, and a lot of workers like who are in their 60s, lost jobs, and many finally, after a couple of years of trying, decided to take an early Social Security. Many have ended up with jobs paying much less. But age discrimination is very, very real, and it's an issue that's actually gaining a lot of attention, and AARP is working on some legislation nationally with that. So thank you for bringing that issue up, because it definitely impacts how long you can work.
Yeah, one issue that I don't think ever gets mentioned is that while people are living longer, they are also entering the workforce a lot later. More people going to, when it started, it was 18 or 19. Now it's up around 24 or 25. That also impacts it.
It does, but boy, that makes me sad because I have a 19-year-old college kid home from break right now who's sitting in my basement not doing a darn thing. But you are right, and I will say there are a lot of, right now we're at this like, oh, no, businesses are sort of clamoring for workers, but the businesses that are clamoring for workers, from at least what I can tell anecdotally, I live in Sun Prairie. On the Sun Prairie Facebook page, consistently posted is, oh, the Subway was closed today because no workers showed up. The Noodles was closed today because nobody showed up. Those are jobs that might be perfectly fine for my 19-year-old kid, but how are they going to be for, someone who is trying to provide for a family or even sort of provide on their own for an individual? So you're right, that definitely is an issue.
We're reading and hearing a lot about artificial intelligence and automation of jobs, resulting in things like, robotic factories, driverless cars and trucks,
Right.
those sorts of things. What's the discussion in ARP or elsewhere about the potential loss of jobs due to automation and artificial intelligence, and how that might impact the future of Social Security?
You know, it's interesting because there really hasn't been a lot of discussion around the impact on jobs around that. I think there are people who would say there'll be different kind of jobs. There'll be sort of higher tech, higher level jobs, but I think everybody knows, there'll be some high tech, high level jobs that can replace that, but it's not going to replace all of the sort of old manufacturing jobs. The one thing I will say, it sort of reminds me of, there were a lot of people who were talking about the impact of the gig economy, and what does that mean? People who are the Lyft drivers and the Uber drivers, or people who are doing Airbnb to kind of, replace their income. Well, what kind of Social Security benefits are you getting if you're a Lyft driver? Those kinds of things. And at first there was a study, and I honestly can't remember the specifics, but the first they said, it's going to have a huge impact. It's going to be, really devastating to people. But then the author sort of came back and said, well, now that we've had a chance to sort of look at it a little bit more, our projections aren't quite as dire, that it's not going to have as big an impact on the sort of economy as we had expected. But in terms of the artificial intelligence stuff, I don't know. I know we're really intrigued by the whole driverless car thing and what it might mean for older people as they drive and can't get around. Kind of scares me, but I'm not there yet. I'm gonna have to, and now you've piqued my curiosity on that, and I'm gonna have to research that on our sites.
Artificial intelligence, there was a big thing on 60 Minutes on Sunday. It's very big in China, is one of the major leaders. Actually, the person that's over there doing it is an American educated person in artificial intelligence. They have spent fortunes on doing with this, and they train their students and everything in this. But he said over 40% of the jobs will be gone or more. And that's going to, where does that leave people to make a living?
Right. And I don't think this was 60 Minutes, but I saw some sliver on some, must have been like Good Morning America or something, about some stuff in China where there was a restaurant where there were no workers and your food was delivered like via a little cart, or in their grocery stores now where you sort of order, not even our order online, but like something goes and picks up all of your stuff. I don't know if we'll ever get to that point, to be quite honest, in the US. I picture us in a restaurant and think, I'm sitting in a restaurant and I want to know, where's the extra ketchup to go with my French fries, and who's bringing me that ketchup? Or, my hamburger is overdone, who's going to take that back? I think it's fascinating, and I wish I knew more about some of that artificial intelligence, and I think 40% of jobs would definitely be devastating to our economy.
Okay, I don't see any more hands up, so we'll take a 10-minute break now. So we'll be back about 5 after 11.
So someone had asked, and this question sort of came up a couple of times when we were talking about SSI, that supplemental security income, and I said, it's not funded out of the Social Security funds. So where is it funded from? It is just funded from general tax revenue, sort of the general revenue that gets allocated by the federal government. So all that stuff we pay in taxes and some stuff that gets added to the deficit, right? It's just general tax revenue. There's not a separate or dedicated income stream to cover SSI payments. So with that, let's talk about Medicare and health care. Because we had some questions that sort of came up earlier. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these. This, of course, is President Johnson signing Medicare into law in 1965. And so then we have Medicare. Workers pay into it, which people always seem to forget that we're actually, paying. It's not huge, but it's a little bit of a payroll tax to pay in for Medicare. so that when we retire, or if we have a disability and are deemed eligible for Medicare, we can have coverage for hospital care, doctor's care, and prescription drugs. So what does Medicare look like in Wisconsin? We have a little over 1 million Medicare beneficiaries in the state of Wisconsin. The vast majority are 65 plus, but we still have about 15% of our Medicare population who get it because they have a disability. I mentioned that Social Security contributes to the economy, right? We've got about $15.6 billion that come in just into Wisconsin from Social Security. People often don't think about the impact that Medicare has on our state economy as well. That is about $11.6 billion into Wisconsin. Although there's long been talks about, the Medicare reimbursement rate in Wisconsin has been sort of less than other states. But $11 billion is still a significant bump into the economy. So that's just always something to keep in mind. Within Wisconsin, with the people that we have in Medicare, 40% are enrolled in Medicare Advantage, which leaves, of course, 60% in traditional Medicare. That's a little bit higher than the national average, but I know Wisconsin has a pretty good variety, a good choice of highly rated Medicare Advantage plans, and so that's a good option for many, many people. Another thing to keep in mind is that Wisconsin Medicare beneficiaries, 30% of our beneficiaries have 2 to 3 chronic conditions. Well, why does this matter? Who cares about that? Well, people with more chronic conditions tend to have higher costs, and you often will hear, sort of a very small slice of Medicare beneficiaries actually account for a lot of the spending, and those with chronic conditions tend to account for a lot of that spending. And as you know, Medicare is not free. A lot of younger people think it's free. I have to look at this because I can't read this slide from here. And it's actually in your packet. I just happen to love this handout because it is a reminder of the out-of-pocket costs that people incur in Medicare. On average, the average out-of-pocket cost $5,680 per year. Largely attributable to premiums, co-payments, deductibles. It's 2013 figures, because when this was made, I think it was made in 2017. Yeah, and so it has gone up because Medicare costs have gone up, healthcare costs have gone up. We still use it to largely. This calculates out to about 17% of an individual's income. And when we're talking about healthcare costs in general, we use it's like largely anywhere between 15 and 20% of a retired individual's income, which is substantial, right? And whether you're talking about Medicare costs for an individual or for the country, we're talking about a lot of money. When we talk about the federal budget, Medicare is about 15% of the federal budget. So anytime we're talking about these deficits and anytime anybody says, oh, spending's out of control, Medicare is always one of the places to look, right? Oh, we've got to rein in these costs. But Medicare is kind of a tougher nut to crack when you think, you probably don't even have to think about it that hard. Obviously it's tied into the healthcare system and to the health insurance system. There are a lot of stakeholders. There are a lot of people who who want to make sure that everybody has access to everything. Medicare is just a harder issue to delve into. A lot of times what we see in healthcare and in Medicare are demonstration projects. We're going to try, and we don't have the answer on how to bring down healthcare costs in a lot of ways, so we're going to try things. We do a lot of demonstration projects. But I want to talk about, just for a minute, a couple of proposals around Medicare that kind of have some attention in Congress. Now, these two proposals really couldn't be much different from each other. The first one I want to talk about is what was all the rage in the last Congress, and is largely a dream of a lot of conservative members of Congress. And this, of course, is turning Medicare into a voucher system. We heard sort of kind of prior to the election, and as we're hearing the talk of the deficit exploding last year, we heard Republican leadership say, well, then the next thing, we've tackled tax reform, the next thing we have to tackle is entitlements. And one of the ways to get to that is to privatize the Medicare system. And this notion of a Medicare voucher system has long been championed by, obviously, Wisconsin's former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. But even though he's gone, and he didn't achieve his dream of this, rest assured there are still a lot of people in Congress who think this is the way to go to help Medicare, be more sustainable, to help bring down the amount of money that Medicare takes out of the federal budget. I will be sort of upfront. AARP is not a fan of the Medicare voucher proposals. It pretty much ends guaranteed benefits. And under a voucher proposal, I should say, I'm assuming most everyone here sort of knows and understands, each individual gets a set amount of money. You go out and buy insurance from a private insurance company. Surely there will be some rules on, what needs to be included, things would need to be actuarially equivalent, but there's no guarantee of the benefits. Right now, whether you're in Medicare, original Medicare or Medicare Advantage, everybody has the same guaranteed set of benefits. Under a Medicare voucher plan, you get a set amount of money, and more than likely, there'll be some things that are covered, but there'll be a lot of things that are not covered. If you want an insurance plan that covers everything, you're going to have to pay more out of your own pocket in order to get that. Also, those vouchers are likely to be tied to something like a chained CPI, so the value of those wouldn't increase as much while insurance costs continue to rise. So you'd be on the hook for more of those costs. And more than likely, you would also you kind of have less access to doctors and hospitals because there would be networks within those private insurance plans. So this whole Medicare voucher thing was really hot and heavy for the past couple of years. Nothing really happened with it. And now we're going way different. We have a new Congress that has a new and different vision for Medicare. Medicare voucher plans are a way to rein in that Medicare spending and to cut that spending. Medicare for All is sort of the hot new buzzword in a lot of the people who were elected to Congress. And to be fair, a lot of people who've been in Congress for a long time. I will tell you, AARP several years ago put together these books of like Medicare proposals that were being considered. And there were 12 proposals that were ways to increase Medicare's solvency. And they had things, a whole range of things like increasing the payroll tax cap or increasing the payroll tax for Medicare, charging people more in terms of premiums. And I know that already happens, doing away with some of the benefits. There are all sorts of things. Nowhere in that booklet was there let people buy into Medicare or let's have Medicare for all. This is something that has really gained traction over the past couple of years. In the past, it was really not seen as politically viable at all. But we have a whole bunch of progressives now who were elected to Congress, and they want to see some kind of change in Medicare, whether we're looking at, and not even just in Medicare, really in the healthcare system, whether you're looking at Medicare for all or a single payer system, right? Universal single payer healthcare that would basically, it would do away with Medicare, right? You do away with Medicare, Medicaid, your private employer sponsored insurance. It would do away with all of that and go to a full-on, all-out 100% single payer universal system. There's sort of a stepping stone to that, which would be more of a buy-in option. Let's let people of a certain age, and they usually use 50, Medicare 50, let's let 50-year-olds buy into Medicare. I will say there are a lot of even Democrats who are not totally on board with this yet, but I think the tide is turning. Speaker Pelosi has signaled support for the process. There will be hearings. For the first time ever, there have actually never been hearings in the House of Representatives on a Medicare for All piece of legislation. So they've committed that there'll be hearings in the Rules Committee and the Budget Committee, which don't really have jurisdiction over the programs, but it's a good first step. And then they're working on they'll have hearings, hopefully, in Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means, which are the committees that do have jurisdiction over things like Medicare and Social Security. And just as a little side note, because I'd mentioned this to someone at the break, not all of the committee assignments are done yet in Congress, but I will say for the Ways and Means Committee in the House, which is a very powerful committee because they're the tax writing committee and the revenue committee when they're looking at any of these programs like Social Security and Medicare, if there's a pay for in it, which of course there always is, if there's a way to fund things via taxes, it goes through Ways and Means. Wisconsin will have 2 members on the Ways and Means Committee. Representative Ron Kind out of La Crosse, he does the 3rd district along the western side of the state, has been on the committee for a while, and he will continue to be on it, and he's on the health subcommittee. And it was just announced a couple of days ago that Congresswoman Gwen Moore from Milwaukee will now also serve on the Ways and Means Committee. So that makes Wisconsin a little bit more important than some of the other states, and we always like that. What else was I going to say about Medicare for All? I just wanted to mention, because I thought this figure was interesting. There was a Harvard Politico poll that was just released like last week. And they were asking as a poll of Americans, what are your priorities for this next Congress? What do you want to see them accomplish? And while support for a truly universal single payer program was really more on the Democratic side, there was actually a decent amount of support for a Medicare buy-in plan across ideologies. 71% of people surveyed supported some kind of Medicare buy-in plan, allowing people age 50 plus to buy into Medicare. And it was 83% of Dems and 60% of Republicans. If you think about it, 5 years ago, it would have been nothing near that level. So one of the strategies with the Progressive Caucus right now in the House, and probably most of you here, I assume, are represented by Congressman Mark Pocan, who is the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, and a huge supporter of single-payer Medicare for All. Their strategy right now is to kind of have these hearings and really build support, both inside Congress and publicly. And it seems like the time is really ripe for some of that support to be building. So,
What are the costs involved in that?
what are the costs involved in that? Well, so I know that Congress is going to ask CBO to cost out what some of the Medicare for All stuff might look like. And here's the thing. Republicans charge that the price tag is really, really huge. And I think it was $32 trillion over 10 years based on a study that was done from George Mason University. And here's where it sort of gets interesting. Because there haven't been any, a CBO score, the Congressional Budget Office sort of takes a look at the policies in a particular piece of legislation, and they estimate what that cost would be. And the CBO score is sort of the kind of the gold standard. It's the driving force. And In terms of, I mean, I know there was legislation that's been introduced in the past, but there wasn't a CBO score on a lot of it. It's one thing to say, we want Medicare for all, we want a single payer. It's very different. There's a lot of support for that notion. It's very different to put together the policies. Senator Sanders, for example, would like to do something where individuals you don't have any co-payments. You have no payments, right? You go to the doctor, you just go to the doctor. You go into the hospital for 3 weeks, you go into the hospital for 3 weeks. You don't have any kind of co-payment at all. That's one model. You know, there are other models where it's sort of like, okay, well then we need to come up with some kind of structure. I think, you know, there's still, something still has to be paid for somehow. Okay, if you don't have any co-payments whatsoever, how do we pay for that? How are we gonna pay for that? So right now, the costs, there's no piece of legislation right now in this current Congress that has been introduced that has a CBO score. That's gonna be the key, though, I think, as to what is it? No. Now, looking at and that's the thing, there are different people who, you know, when you look at something like, okay, well, we're gonna let people buy in, and what does that mean? At what level? You know, if you're on Medicare right now, your Medicare premium is basically, you're paying about 25% of the premium costs, and the feds are picking up about 75% of the premium costs. That makes it relatively affordable for most people in your Medicare premium, right? How do you do that? You keep that same kind of affordability for people who are buying in at age 50? Or is it, you know, or is it like, oh, well, sure, you can buy in, but you have to pay the full cost, and then all of a sudden their premium is, you know, $700 a month, and is that affordable, and how will all of that work? It's the notion right now, sort of the idea of healthcare is a right, not a privilege. You know, we should be covering more people. It's harder when you start to pull out all of those policies. But here's the good thing, is I actually think that there are people in this Congress who are going to start that process, where before people have said, oh, we should have Medicare for all. And it hasn't even been viable. There's viability to it now. There's support within Congress, and there's support, more importantly, within the public. You know, people are kind of seeing, oh, you know, I'm not so sure about this, you know, what we're doing. Maybe we need something different. So they're going to start to crack that nut. And I don't know if you guys can remember back 10 years, and I'm going to kind of talk in a second about some of the Affordable Care Act stuff. But if you can remember back 10 years when the Affordable Care Act passed, some people hated it because, you know, it wasn't Medicare for all. It wasn't a universal single payer system. But there are a lot of people who said, you know what? One of AARP's favorite things is, oh, it's a good first step. And I actually think it was, because look how the public attitudes have changed, because now all of a sudden we all think people with pre-existing conditions should be covered. And no, you shouldn't be allowed to charge them, you know, 1 million times more than what they were doing. And no, you can't kick people off of insurance when they were sick. But 15 years ago, that's the way it was. That's what it accepted. So I think the Affordable Care Act has actually put us a little bit on the path. Yeah. Oh, yes, you can ask, and then I think I have to repeat. So the question is, have there been any studies that would show how letting Medicare negotiate drug prices, how would that impact the cost? And we're going to talk about some prescription drug stuff. And unfortunately, off the top of my head, I don't have any good numbers right now, because again, that's been a thing where people have said, oh, we should allow Medicare to negotiate, but legislatively, there's been no traction for it. But there's traction for it, and there's a bill. Newly introduced bills allowing Medicare to negotiate, on which I think we might see some traction. there's not a CBO score yet. They just got introduced on like January 8th or 9th. But yes, and I do think that would have a positive impact on Medicare costs. I want to talk, I know you guys wanted me to really talk about Medicare, but what's interesting is where Congress is going to put their attention first while they're doing this sort of Medicare for all, they have to do some stuff around the Affordable Care Act, which, like I said, I think gets us to where Medicare changes will be. And one of the first things that Congress has to focus on is really shoring up the Affordable Care Act. And that has been what Speaker Pelosi has said, that's what their main focus is going to be, and some of the things they need to tackle. I put this up here as just a very quick reminder of some of the things that the Affordable Care Act did, and some of the things that Congress will have to sort of focus on a little bit. It changed the individual insurance market with the addition of this marketplace where people could buy insurance if they weren't covered. Well, so Congress is going to need to stabilize that marketplace, which has been sort of hacked at in a couple of different ways. I was talking, maybe before we got started, Jack and I were talking a little bit about Medicaid expansion. Of course, another really big part of the Affordable Care Act. There are 13 million people in 32 states and the District of Columbia that are now covered by Medicaid expansion. Wisconsin is not one of them for right now, but I know we're going to be working to hopefully change that. I will say I am from Nebraska, and Nebraska is a very Republican, a very conservative state. In this last election, Nebraska actually passed a referendum to expand Medicaid. So if Nebraska can do it, come on, Wisconsin. AARP obviously supports Medicaid expansion, and the feds will pay for most of it. Yes? Before Walker, it was 130% of poverty. Right. I mean, she was sort of, and I'm not sure if everybody heard that, but I'll repeat it for folks. Wisconsin used to have a higher eligibility rate for people to enter Medicaid. Wisconsin actually had a really good way of covering childless adults before Governor Walker came in. When they were doing Medicaid expansion, rather than taking Medicaid expansion, Governor Walker sort of redid it in a way where we actually dropped people from the Medicaid rolls. We lowered the eligibility to 100% of the federal poverty level for childless adults to be eligible for Medicaid. Because we did that, we didn't reach the 138% level of the federal poverty level that was required in order to draw some extra Medicaid expansion funds from the federal government. They were going to pay 100% for 3 years and then 90% after that. And the argument at the time was, well, we can't count on Congress that they're always going to pay that, so the state can't afford that. With Wisconsin leaving, I think it's $138 million on the table when it comes to Medicaid expansion. It will be very interesting to see what happens at the state level with Medicaid expansion. Of course, Governor Evers would like to see Medicaid expanded. We have still a full Republican legislature who does not want to see Medicaid expanded. But they're going to have a really hard time trying. Governor Evers, I assume, will put that in his budget proposal and will include the federal money in his budget proposal. And so it will be up to the state's Joint Finance Committee and the state's legislature to figure out where they're going to get the rest of that money. You can tell AARP supports Medicaid expansion. And so that might be a topic for another day and down the line after the budget stuff. But Medicaid expansion is actually pretty popular. About 75% of the public, just overall, has a favorable view of Medicaid expansion. I also just want to mention, okay, the protections for people with pre-existing condition, it's not only, that you can't deny coverage, that you can't kick people off insurance once they get sick. You also can't charge people more because they have a pre-existing condition, or because they're a woman, which used to be a pre-existing condition. Right. I mean, and these are things that went on for years and years and years. This is why I think the Affordable Care Act has such a big impact in where we're going with healthcare and how it has paved the way for where we're now all of a sudden talking about Medicare for all. New requirements for employer-covered benefits. We mentioned those 19-year-olds at college and maybe not working till they're 24. Well, the good news is at least now we can cover those kids with your employer insurance benefits up to age 26, these adult children, as they're called, which is wildly popular. And I think how many? 2.3 million kids are covered this way. That's a pretty fair amount of kids, so that's actually really good. We've also gotten rid of annual and lifetime limits on your benefits. Remember, there was a point in time, if you got really sick, once your insurance company paid so much out, you were done. In today's world, it doesn't take long to reach $1 million lifetime limit, and then they wouldn't cover you anymore. Certain preventive services are provided at no cost. And then, of course, it closed the Medicare Part D donut hole. I'm going to come back to, which is also very, very popular. I'm going to come back to that because I do want to talk about prescription drugs. We're going to move along very quickly because I didn't realize what time it was. You can't read this chart very well, probably up here. It didn't print very well on your handouts, and that's okay. I kind of just wanted to put it up there. This was from a Kaiser tracking poll, and if you're really into healthcare policy and wonky, you should check out the Kaiser Family Foundation stuff. They do super cool healthcare stuff. This basically shows support for different elements within the Affordable Care Act between Democrats on the top in the light blue and Republicans in the bottom on the dark blue. And I won't necessarily go through all of them, but I just wanted to sort of point out on some stuff like closing the Medicare Part D donut hole, which is sort of the third one down, very, very close in terms of 85% of Dems support it, 80% of Republicans support it. On a lot of these, the items are much closer. The support between Democrats and Republicans is much closer than you might suspect. Medicaid expansion, which is the second from the bottom, obviously that's not as close. 91% of Dems support that, but 55% of Republicans do. That, sometimes if you listen to the rhetoric in Congress, you think 0% of, Americans who identify as Republicans support this. That's not true. The support for these things is a little bit more even-handed among the public. So I just kind of wanted to sort of highlight that. And then before we talk about prescription drugs, I just want to mention some of the things that Congress really is going to have to focus on that's on their plate, because a lot has been done to undermine the Affordable Care Act. Although it's popular, it's been a 10-year goal of Republicans in Congress to undo the Affordable Care Act, of course, which they have not been successful at. But they have been sort of picking at it and undermining it in lots of different ways. In the tax reform bill, they eliminated the penalty for the individual mandate, right? And that's what said, okay, everybody has to have insurance or else you have to pay a penalty. That's what made insurance companies say, yeah, heck, we'll hop into this. If everybody has to be covered, that, spreads out the risk. That means healthy people have to go in. That helps insurance companies. But now that penalty has been done away with. And that has really led to some instability within that individual marketplace. And so Congress is going to have to deal with that. The Trump administration did a lot of stuff to basically make enrollment in the ACA marketplace pretty much as difficult as possible. When it first started, there was a substantial amount of money given to outreach and enrollment. Wisconsin had a terrific organization that had people virtually in every county covering Wisconsin, helping people navigate, the system to sort of enroll in the insurance and get subsidies to help pay for their insurance. That enrollment assistance funding was slashed by like 90%, leaving virtually no help. All of this has to be done by a website. The website was taken down for maintenance like every Sunday night. I mean, they did all this stuff to just make it as hard as possible for people to get enrolled. At the end of the day, though, last year there were 8.7 million people enrolled in the individual marketplace. This year there's 8.4 million. So people were still sort of kept at it, and they still got at it despite all of the hoops and hurdles that they had to jump through to get there. And then there's another piece that is actually kind of a dangerous piece that maybe people have read about or heard about. The Trump administration, there is a rule that is now in effect as of August 1st that has to do with skinny plans. Skinny plans are also known as short-term, limited duration healthcare plans, and they've existed for a while. They basically are a 3-month plan that people could get, say if you were in between jobs, or maybe you didn't qualify for a special enrollment period in something. There was sort of some reason where people could get these plans, but they were limited to 3-month coverage, and that's it. And then you couldn't renew them. So this, and then you couldn't get it like, oh, well, now I've been diagnosed with this, let me get covered for 3 months. There were some specific ways you could use it. Well, the Trump administration basically did away with the 3-month limit. They are now good for 364 days, renewable up to 3 times. The problem with these plans is they don't have to follow any of the Affordable Care Act consumer protections. They don't have to cover all the essential benefits. They don't have to cover pre-existing conditions. It's really sort of a catastrophic plan. They're really just crummy insurance. They'll be cheaper because they're crummy insurance. But they're also likely to draw healthier people who don't expect to use insurance out of that insurance pool. So anyway, that's sort of one of the things that has been sort of done to undo another part of the Affordable Care Act. And then, of course, there's the federal lawsuit that's been being led by the Republican states, where the federal judge in Texas has now ruled the entire Affordable Care Act is no longer valid because that penalty doesn't exist. Of course, that's been appealed. We'll see what Wisconsin is able to do. Wisconsin was part of the Republican-led lawsuit against the ACA. And this, of course, is where, Governor Evers, I'm sure, was looking quite forward to coming into office and saying, heck no, my attorney general is not going to participate in that. And that's where the legislature in Wisconsin did their lame duck work and sort of took that power away from Wisconsin. But Governor Evers is, going to work around some of that. So we won't get too far into some of that piece. I will say that I know when Congress sort of looks at all of this, and even some of the next stuff around, I want to talk about prescription drugs quickly. They don't have a lot of time to work on some of this. I know in Congress they sort of think, okay, maybe we've got and this was even before, they're sort of thinking maybe we've got 6 months to get something done before basically the 2020 presidential election kind of impinges on what's going to happen. So, and I'll try to come back to that in a little bit. So there are a lot of things that need to be done in a relatively short amount of time. And of course, Congress's attention right now is on the government shutdown. One area where we actually thought there, and I'm going to be positive, I think there's still room for some bipartisan work, is around the issue of prescription drugs. That Harvard Politico poll that I mentioned, where they asked people, what do you want Congress to work on? The #1 priority is to bring down the cost of prescription drugs. And this doesn't matter whether Republican, Democrat, nobody likes the high cost of prescription drugs. Allowing Medicare to negotiate for better drug prices is a huge priority. And so Medicare, when Medicare Part D started, there was something within Medicare Part D, a provision was not only, doesn't the Secretary of HHS negotiate, but it actually outlawed it. It basically said the Secretary of HHS cannot negotiate for better drug prices. And that may have been what you had asked about this a little bit before. Did AARP support that? And I will say AARP supported the creation of Medicare Part D. Was it perfect? No. But at the time, and I think even still now, it was a huge help in terms of prescription drug prices for people. Did we support every single provision in it? No. We have always supported the idea that Medicare should negotiate drug prices. So it wasn't a perfect bill, but as we said, it was a good first step, right? So we've always wanted Medicare to be able to negotiate drug prices. Congress could pass something that says, take away that, let's give the Secretary of HHS, it's called secretarial negotiation, let's give them the power to negotiate those drug prices. Democrats in Congress really want it. President Trump has actually talked about it several times. His Secretary of HHS is not supportive of it at all. But I think this is one area where a lot of people seem to think something could happen. Now, I think it was more likely, honestly, before a little bit of the rancor of this government shut down. There's like, hey, here's one area where the public wants this, and Democrats want it, and Republicans have, said they want it, and even the president has said we're open to it. But now everybody's mad at each other. So hopefully we can kind of get over that. There have been, I was kind of looking to see if I had the bill numbers. No, but on January 8th, there was a House bill that was introduced to allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Congressman Pocan is one of the original co-sponsors of that bill. There's also a bill in the Senate that was introduced allowing the same, and Senator Baldwin is one of the original co-sponsors on that bill. The Senate bill is all Democratic. The House bill, at this point, didn't have a ton of sponsors, maybe 8 or 9, but there was one Republican as a lead sponsor on that bill. I do think this is an area where we're going to see traction. I think it's a substantial savings, and I'm sorry, I don't know what the exact savings amount would be, but I think this is an area where we might actually see something. I will give credit where credit is due. Within the Trump administration, there is at least acknowledgement that prescription drug prices are out of whack, and they're attempting to do something. And so the president has actually proposed making some changes to the way that some drugs are paid for in Medicare Part B, but he wants to tie them to an international drug pricing index. This has gotten basically support from no one. From drug companies hate it, all of the disease groups hate it, people hate it, doctors hate it. I mean, it's not really going to go anywhere. But like I said, I'll give credit where credit is due, and there was some attempt to put something out there. Where there's room for maybe something else to happen will be along the line of generics. Especially if there's some kind of legislation, and there are different pieces that increase competition, that's also likely to get a little bit more support from Republicans as well as Democrats. And also the new chair of the Senate Finance Committee, which will have jurisdiction over a lot of this, hates pharmaceutical companies, so that helps, and he's a Republican, right? Have RX Price Watch on here, and I just kind of, AARP has this thing called RX Price Watch, and there are lots of people who sort of take a look at the cost of prescription drugs, and you maybe saw in the paper that at the beginning of 2019, the cost of drugs went up like 6.3% on like 250 different drugs. After a while, when pharmaceutical companies were saying, no, we're good, because they were getting really afraid, right? They're starting, like, again, everyone in the public says, let's lower the cost of prescription drugs. So drug companies are like, well, we're going to be good. We're not going to hike them quite as much, But then at the beginning of the year, they were kind of like, well, nothing really happened to us so far, so let's hike them and see what happens. Well, that made President Trump mad. He called a bunch of people in and said, okay, we got to do something about this. Nothing's really happened with that yet because, of course, now we're busy on some other topics and government shutdown things. But I think, again, I'm going to be positive. I think prescription drug prices are where it's going to be. One last thing I want to mention is the Medicare Part D donut hole. In the Affordable Care Act, that donut hole was set to close in 2020. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that your drugs are free in the donut hole. It means you're just paying the 25% copay. But remember, it used to be a lot more, if you even remember that. In that bipartisan budget bill that Congress passed, one of the things I said that added to the deficit, and it did, but one of the things they did was actually good for seniors who hit the donut hole, is they closed the donut hole a year earlier in 2019. So starting this year, rather than in 2020, that donut hole will be closed and there will only be a 25% copayment. Now, I will say pharma pretty much hated that, and they spent about the last 6 months of last year trying to undo that, because it's basically they're giving bigger discounts is what it sort of amounts to, is kind of how some of that's getting paid for. And pharma said, no, we're just let it be 2020. We don't want to give that up. But AARP and some other groups were kind of like, yeah, you know what? Congress already did this. It's a done deal. And so we actually had kind of a little mini campaign to make sure that members of Congress knew that pharma was trying to undo it. And we were successful. And so now it won't get changed at all with the Democratic House. But so now the donut hole in Part D is officially closed for 2019, a year earlier that it was set out to be. Caregiving, I'm going to talk 1 second about caregiving. I only mention this because caregiving is going to be a super hot topic for AARP at the federal level and at the state level. And we're going to see more and more about it. I don't know if anybody happened to see yesterday's edition of USA Today, where the actor Rob Lowe, if people know who Rob Lowe is, wrote an op-ed about the caregiving challenges that he faced. So putting kind of a high-profile face on that. But we really are having caregiving challenges in this country. We have a lot of family caregivers who are doing a lot of unpaid work, and there's move legislatively at both the federal level and the state level to help support those family caregivers. Senator Baldwin is a huge lead in the Senate around the issue of caregiving, passed something called the Raise Family Caregiver Act, which they're working now on sort of implementing, bringing a group of stakeholders together to make recommendations to help caregivers. So just know that's an area that I think is big. I'm going to leave you with just a couple of resources, and it's really in many ways a shameless plug for AARP's website. In part because, and then I have one other thing. So there's this aarp.org/Medicare, which is our website. They have a terrific Q&A section. You can really, and this is not just policy too, this is benefits. I don't really know all the ins and outs of benefits and how to save money and how to do all of that stuff. But the aarp.org Medicare really is a terrific resource. And if people don't know about the Wisconsin Medigap Helpline, they're also a fabulous resource. They're run by the state. They're not run by any insurance companies. They will sort of help you figure out, is Medicare Advantage okay? Is traditional Medicare okay? They'll help you work through some things. And then when it comes to Social Security, AARP also has the same thing, aarp.org/Social Security resources. So really good resources there. Again, that's my shameless plug. And then finally, we are hip. We are AARP. If you are on Facebook, follow us. We have a Facebook page, AARP Wisconsin. We're on Twitter, and we're on Twitter because here Kathleen's like, what? But your elected officials are all on Facebook and Twitter. Media, they're on Facebook and Twitter. So we have all of those. But we also just have our regular website for Wisconsin as well. So check us out on Facebook. You'll find some fun things about what we're doing locally. So, questions? We have time. That went.
Have just a minute or two.
I know.
Well, you had a drawing you wanted to try to do or something.
I did. Well, here's the thing. So I had 3 sets. Not that any of you are dummies. You're all very smart, right? A Medicare for Dummies and Social Security for Dummies. I have 3 sets of these. So I don't know, does anybody have a January birthday?
It's,
1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So whose birthday? I don't know. Whose birthday's closest? You give
would
me.
each of you like the set of books?
There are a couple.
Yes or no?
Yes. Yes. I've got one over there. And I'll give you these. If anybody else really wants copies of these. The 10th, awesome. And there was a,
But you'd already committed it over
yeah,
the other
I'm
side.
sorry, I've already committed one over here. Do you want it? Okay. Here's what I'm gonna do. Come up and see me. I'll get your name and address and I'll mail you some. If you have a scrap piece of paper too, if you want to write your name and address on it now and bring it to me, I'll mail them out to you.
Okay, well, before we take questions, I want to thank Lisa for her presentation. We have a small token of appreciation. It's a very nice umbrella.
Sweet.
Hopefully you don't need it today.
This is so cool, thank you.
But I think, I think everyone agrees with me that this was an excellent presentation. We thank you for coming and making the time for doing this for us.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Now, we have 5 minutes. If there are questions, please raise your hand. I'll bring you a microphone. Just keep it close to your mouth because it took me a while to learn to do that.
Thanks. You mentioned the $32 trillion cost for a universal health care system, but that's a savings over what we're currently paying of around $3 trillion. And that never gets mentioned.
Right, and you have to sort of take a look at, what's the total cost of the current healthcare system, and not only what we're actually paying, but all of the sort of excess that doesn't go to healthcare, right? Sort of all of the administration, all of those pieces. The thing is, when people hear, it's going to cost $32 trillion, alarm bells, go off. And it will be interesting to see. I don't think we'll get, certainly not in this Congress, but probably not in the near future, to a full single-payer system. But again, I think we're going to take some sort of good first steps to move towards some of that. And maybe it's the allowing people to buy in. There was a lot, if you think about back to the ACA debates, because they were changing some of the structure of things. And when you change that whole system structure, there was a lot of push and pull, and there are a lot of, there's a lot at stake. There are a lot of different stakeholders. Insurance companies will say, when we talked about the sort of jobs, what happens to what happens when artificial intelligence takes over jobs? Well, what happens to all those insurance company employees when you don't need all of them? I'm just saying, there are lots of different sides that need to be considered.
Yes, the Affordable Care Act, I do not have to take any prescription drugs, but I was paying senior care
Yes.
$30 a year for that in case somewhere's down the road I wanted to or did have to take prescription drugs so I could sign up for something.
Yes.
Do I still have to do that, or is that?
Yes, you still have to do that. And if there's anybody who doesn't know about senior care, please Google it, please look it up. Senior care is a Wisconsin state-run prescription drug program for people age 65 plus. It helps with the cost of prescription drugs on some sort of income sliding scales. But what it really helps with are for people who should be signing up for Medicare Part D. If you don't sign up for Medicare Part D when you're first eligible, you pay a penalty. Unless you have actuarially equivalent coverage somewhere else. Senior care is that actuarially equivalent coverage, and it costs you $30 a year to sign up for it. So if you stay on that for 10 years, when you decide, I'm going to go to Medicare Part D, you will not be charged a penalty because you've been on senior care. You can sign up for senior care no matter what your income is. You'll just never see the benefit of saving money on drugs, but you'll see the benefit of having that coverage. And it's like a 2-page application. It's super simple. It's a really easy application. So I encourage you, if you haven't done that, check it out. That's a great strategy.
Well, and the interesting thing about it is it's much cheaper to operate because the drug industry has to contribute a large amount of rebates to it. So it's much cheaper than Part D. Of course, nobody wanted to see it ever expanded beyond Wisconsin. And they haven't managed to kill it yet.
They haven't managed to kill it yet. And senior care negotiates for its drug prices, so they do get good rebates. And that's why I think people were so resistant to Part D in Wisconsin, because we had this great program, and that would have ideally been the thing to take national, but we got Part D.
Just a comment. When I travel, I take my medication lists to the pharmacies because in other countries, the cost of prescription drugs, which you don't need a prescription for usually when you walk into a pharmacy, is less than my copay.
Yeah, that's crazy. I know a lot of people support importation of drugs from other countries, which would be fine, except why can't we just pay those lower prices here, right? Why do we have to pay the highest prices in the world? We shouldn't have to. That's a good strategy also in the interim.
Okay, well, thank you very much again, Lisa.
Sure, thank you. Thank you all.
And everyone have a good day, and thank you for staying.